You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell." I have to admit that when we started this series, I hadn't totally taken on board what topics it would include and what I would be talking about. You will have seen in our monthly newsletter, today's topic is titled Faithful in Marriage. However, it relates to far more than that, as we will see. And it doesn't just relate to men. So this is the second illustration of "You have heard it said." And the scribes and Pharisees had reduced the commandment who prohibits adultery to the sheer physical act of adultery. And imagine that as long as they were not guilty of the act themselves, the commandment had nothing to say to them, and therefore they were innocent. Last week, they had taken the letter of the law and reduced it to one particular thing, and thereby nullified it. In particular, they had forgotten the whole spirit of the law, something vital in the understanding of the New Testament gospel. The letter kills, but the spirit gives life. The problem with the scribes and Pharisees was that they never understood the Ten Commandments clearly. For if they had, they would have realized that you can't take one in isolation. For example, the 10th says that we must not covet our neighbor's wife, and that it should be read with that of the commandment to not commit adultery. Paul himself in Romans 7 confesses that he had been guilty of this. He says that when he realized that the law said, "Thou shalt not covet," he began to understand the meaning of lust. Before that, he'd been thinking of the law in terms of action only. But the law of God does not stop at mere action. It says, "Thou shalt not covet," which means you shouldn't want someone else's property. You see, the law had always stressed the importance of the heart. And these people, with their mechanical notions of worshipping God and their purely mechanical thoughts of obedience, had entirely forgotten that. And Jesus is anxious to stress the important truth and to impress it upon his followers. It is here again where we have our Lord's teaching with regard to the nature of sin. And the whole purpose of the law, as Paul reminds us, was to show the sinfulness of sin. However, the Pharisees not only misunderstood it, but totally nullified it. Sadly, today, sin is not a popular word. And we dismiss that we have even sinned. And we deny profusely that we have any sin in us. It has been said that most of our failures and troubles in the church, as well as in the world, are due to the fact that we have not really understood this teaching. And unless we are clear about the doctrine of sin, the teaching of sin, we shall never truly understand the New Testament way of salvation. Just think about the death of Jesus on the cross and the misunderstanding with regard to it. However, there is one question we may face. Why did he have to die upon the cross? Why did Jesus go to Jerusalem and allow his followers to defend him? Why did he say that if he desired, he could command 12 legions of angels to protect him? But if he did so, he would not fulfill all righteousness. What then is the meaning of the death upon the cross? Now, if we don't understand the teaching, the doctrine of sin, we shall never really understand the answer to these questions. There is only one way to understand the death of Christ, and it is this: There was no other good enough to pay the price of sin. He could only unlock the gate of heaven and let us in. Now, I'm going to be using some big words today, so some of them will not make sense, and I'm sorry about that. Sometimes you can't use other words. It is because of sin that the incarnation was necessary. To tell humankind what to do is not enough. God had done that in the law given through Moses, but no one had kept it. It says there was none righteous, not even one. All attempts to get the people to live a better life had failed even before Jesus came. The Greek philosophers had all lived and taught before his birth, but knowledge and information and all these things are not enough. Why? Because of sin in the human heart. So the only way to understand the New Testament doctrine of salvation is to start with the doctrine of sin. And this sin could only be dealt with by the coming of the eternal God, the eternal Son of God, from heaven to this world, and by his actually going to the death on the cross. That had to happen, for there was no other way to God. You see, God allowed his one and only Son to suffer in the way he did because of sin. But the same is true of the New Testament doctrine of renewal. The words born again and new creation is found right through the gospel and the epistles. This is all meaningless unless you understand the New Testament doctrine of sin. But if you do understand it, then you can see quite clearly that unless you're born again and given a new nature and a new heart, you cannot be saved. And now for my third but. But renewal is meaningless if you have a negative view of sin and do not realize its profoundness. If you do not see your actions and desires as sin, if you believe it's okay to do that, well, it's nothing really. If that's what you're truly thinking, then you're standing on a slippery slope and already sliding down it. 4 members of a church congregation with concerned faces met in the pastor's office. With earnest and imploring eyes, they presented him with a clipboard filled with a sheet of signatures. This petition, said the spokesperson of the group, requests changing the term sinner to person who is morally challenged. In today's world, we have belittled sin into something that only real sinners do, those murderers, those pedophiles, those terrorists. Now we need to look at ourselves and examine our hearts and fall on our knees in humility and seek forgiveness. We need to totally understand that God allowed his Son to suffer because of all that we have done wrong and sinned, and all that we will do in the future. If our evangelism has simply come to Jesus and offers him a friend and a new life without the convicting of sin, it is not New Testament evangelism. Throughout the New Testament, we see example upon example of Jesus actually pushing people away. He put obstacles in their way. In effect, he said, "Do you realize what you're doing? Have you counted the cost? Do you realize where it may lead you? Do you know it means denying self and taking up your cross and following me daily?" You see, it is our duty to explain the holiness of God, his demands, and also the consequences of sin. It is Jesus himself who speaks about being cast into hell because of sin. So evangelism must start with the holiness of God, the sinful nature of humankind, the demands of the law, the punishment, the consequences of evil and wrongdoing. Then and only then is when a person can truly seek Christ for deliverance and forgiveness. Now, having looked at the reasons for concentrating on the doctrine of sin, We now will look at what actually Jesus says about it. There is no true understanding of the gospel of salvation, no true evangelism, no true holiness, no true knowledge of the love of God, unless we realize what sin is. So what is it? The first thing Jesus emphasizes is what we may call the depth or the power of sin. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Jesus doesn't say, as long as you don't do the act, then all is well. He says, rather I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. The same applies to women who look at men. You see, sin is not just a matter of actions and deeds. It is something within the heart that leads to the action. In other words, the teaching here is a characteristic teaching of the Bible everywhere about this subject, and that we must truly concentrate upon is not so much sins as sin. Sins are the symptoms of a disease called sin. And it's not the symptoms that matter, but the disease. For it's the disease that kills and not the symptoms. Shall I try and say that again? Sins are the symptoms of a disease called sin. And it's not the symptoms that matter, but the disease. For it is the disease that kills and not the symptoms. This is the truth that Jesus is trying to impress upon us. The fact that you have not committed adultery does not mean that you're guiltless. What about your heart? Is there disease there? Scripture tells us that God made man perfect. However, that perfection was lost at the fall when Adam ate the forbidden fruit. Sin entered human nature and allowed this evil force within. The consequence is that we now desire and covet. We crave for something which is not ours. Remember that Jesus said, it is out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murderers, adulterers. So we must understand that sin is a terrible power. And it's not so much that I do something, but what urges me to do it that matters. It is there in all of us, and we must face it, the depth and power of sin. But let me say a word about the subtleness of sin. Sin is a terrible thing which deludes and fools us to make us feel happy and contented so long as we have not committed the act. We might say, yes, I was tempted, but I thank God I did not fall. And in a sense, up to a point, that is all right. But we should ask ourselves, why did I want to do it in the first place? That's where the subtlety of sin comes in. And what about our minds? What goes on up there? Those guilty secrets that only you and God knows. And why do we like reading the gutter press and the stories of someone getting caught out? The answer is simple. We enjoy it. We are sinning in the heart and mind and in our imagination. And that makes us guilty of adultery. Then there is the perverting nature and effect of sin. Sin is something that perverts. And Jesus says, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Sin can turn the very thing that was meant to do good into something bad. You see, sin twists everything. So that precious gifts, such as the hand or the eye, have become a nuisance to me. And I have, metaphorically, to cut them off and pluck them out. I have to get rid of them. It is sin that has perverted humankind, turning good into evil. Sin is destructive. Sin destroys. It was sin that introduced death into the life of man and death into the world. It always leads to death and ultimately to hell, suffering and punishment. It is hateful to God. It is abhorrent to him. But we all know the scriptures. The wages of sin is death. I strongly feel that today we have lost all knowledge of what sin is. It's as though we can be a Christian and still do the things of our past nature, still mess about in certain areas and hope that we won't get caught out. And if we do, I'll just take myself to another church. They'll accept me. Sin is anything that comes between you and God. It is not just thoughts in our minds of adultery. It can be anything. In closing, we need to examine ourselves. Examine our thoughts, our desires, our imagination. And if we see within us how messed up we really are and how poor in spirit we are, then we need to hunger and thirst after righteousness. But I thank God I have a gospel which tells me of another who is spotless and pure and totally holy and has taken my sin and my guilt upon himself. I am washed in his precious blood, and he has given me his own nature. And when I realized that I needed a new heart, I found, thank God, that he had come and given me one. I pray that is the truth for you too, that you have found God, that you've asked Jesus into your lives, that you've realized you've messed up, you've got it wrong, you've asked for his forgiveness, and you've asked him to come and take control of your life. If you've not done that, in the silence of your hearts, close your eyes and ask Jesus into your life.